Washington Talk, I'm Eun Cho. North Korea called off a high-level meeting with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It is also yet to hold a working-level meeting with Special Representative Steve Biegun. Why is North Korea dragging its feet? And what is U.S. strategy against North Korea's intransigence?
I think it's going fine. We're in no rush. We're in no hurry. The sanctions are on, but they have to be responsive too. It's a two-way street.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also joining me today, Mr. Dennis Wilder, professor at the Georgetown University. Mr. Wilder was senior director at the National Security Council and spent more than 3 decades at the CIA. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. North Korea canceled the high-level meeting at the very last minute, just 2 days before Secretary Pompeo was to meet with a top North Korean official, Kim Yong-chol. Why do you think is that?
Well, frankly, we don't know. They didn't give much of a reason publicly for this. And in fact, at the beginning, it was a little difficult to know whether it was the North Korean side who actually did it. We now know that it was the North Koreans. I think that we are seeing some gamesmanship here on the part of the North Koreans. You'll remember Pompeo canceled the visit to Pyongyang. Perhaps the North Koreans want to increase the sort of heighten the tension a little bit before they come to a meeting. I also think it has something to do with this whole discussion of sanctions and easing of sanctions. I was interested to see that the Russians called for a meeting on sanctions at the UN exactly at the time when Pompeo and the North Koreans were supposed to meet. I do wonder if there's some coordination going on between North Korea, Russia, and probably the Chinese on this whole question of trying to get the sanctions eased.
I think Dennis makes a good point. Clearly, the North Koreans are looking for sanctions relief. They're looking for an end-of-war declaration. And in the negotiations for those two achievable objectives for the North, they don't want to dispatch a high-level official and get nothing done. And I don't think the Trump administration is ready to move on either sanctions relief or an end-of-war declaration at this point in time. They're still waiting for the North to make more serious gestures about denuclearization. So I think the North Koreans may have pushed the pause button here. They want to take a moment to assess how serious the Trump administration is about following through on the promises of the Singapore summit. And they may also be taking stock of the political environment in Washington as well, and trying to make sure in their own minds that Trump can deliver on his promises.
But if North Korea wants sanctions relief, isn't this more of a reason for North Korea to come to the table and talk to the United States rather than canceling this? So is North Korea using the old playbook and doing the brinkmanship again?
You know, I have some worries that the North Koreans have been emboldened by what has happened in the sort of six-party relationships and the dynamics there. If you look at it, the South Koreans obviously are at a different place than they were. I think the Chinese are in a very different place than they were a few months ago. The Russians clearly are supportive of some of these things. And so I think for the North Koreans, they think there's a different dynamic going on right now, and they want to push. But I do worry that they're going to push a little too hard.
I think, Dennis, you know, maybe what we're overlooking here is there may be a fundamental poor assessment here in the United States, and maybe in Seoul as well, about how the sanctions are really affecting North Korea. From what I can tell, The sanctions have put a kind of a cap on North Korea's long-term economic outlook. They know that they've got to get rid of those sanctions if they want to have a bright economic future. But in the meantime, I don't see evidence that they are suffering. You know, a lot of our sentiment about North Korea desperately wanting sanctions relief is based on, I think, a faulty assumption that their economy is in free fall, or that their economy is suffering to the point where the leadership is under some growing and significant pressure to get sanctions relief. And I'm not sure that's true. The sanctions have not crippled him. We know that they're cheating on the sanctions, and we also know that ever since the summitry, enforcement of the sanctions by China and others has frankly slackened a bit, giving North Korea maybe a little more breathing room.
If I can build on that for just a moment, one of the things that impressed me at the end of last year was China's decision to cut off refined petroleum to North Korea. That made a difference, because that really did hurt the North Koreans in a way that other sanctions don't.
Yes.
They cannot produce refined petroleum. And that's one of the reasons you see these ship-to-ship transfers of refined petroleum. I worry that the Chinese have backed away from that, because the refined petroleum was actually not something that was banned under the UN sanctions.
That's right, just a quota.
Just a quota. So I think what the Chinese have done is they've gone back to living up to the letter, but not the spirit of the sanctions, similarly with the Russians. And the North Koreans, as Frank was saying, I think what we've got now is a North Korea that sees it can play for a while, because it's not under the severe pressure it was at the end of last year, beginning of the new year.
So President Trump says that sanctions are still on. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said North Korea has done nothing to ease the sanctions on North Korea. But North Korea, since last week, has been very urgently wanting the sanctions relief, saying that it would even build up nuclear arsenal. So how should U.S. respond to North Korea's request to ease sanctions?
I would take a tougher line with the North Koreans. I think that President Trump has been almost bending over backward in recent times. I was glad, for example, to see the Marine exercise go on. I think we need to signal to the North Koreans that, you know, we can reverse course, that we can put more pressure on them, that we can go back to exercises. I do worry that waiting too long to go back to major exercises, we are degrading our readiness. You know, American forces in Korea only stay 1 or 2 years. And so we may need to sort of signal a bit tougher stance, a bit more willingness to postpone the next summit if there isn't movement.
I think Dennis's encouragement to the U.S. to think about how we could increase pressure, you know, makes a lot of sense. I worry, though, that could put us out of step with our South Korean allies. And those threats to sort of ratchet the pressure back up again are only credible if Seoul is in lockstep with us, and they are trending in a different direction. So if I were advising the president at this moment, you know, I would tell him to focus on achievable objectives. So if the North wants sanctions relief, and if we are prepared to provide limited sanctions relief, what do we demand in return? And if what we're looking for is an achievable denuclearization step, such as shutting down Yongbyon, freezing that reactor, shutting down the production of fissile material, then I think we might be able to get a breakthrough and provide limited sanctions relief that the North is looking for in response for a meaningful denuclearization step that we need. But if we continue to swing for the fences and sort of demand a big breakthrough, we may be frustrated.
Now, Frank, you were in the Congress for a long time. You were advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And recently, the midterm elections, the Democrats won the House of Representatives. And how would this impact North Korea policy?
Very little. In a good way, North Korea policy has always been relatively nonpartisan. I think Republicans and Democrats alike supported the maximum pressure and engagement strategy of President Trump, just as they also supported the strategic patience of Obama, not rushing to try to make a bad deal. So now that the Democrats control the House, I think the major difference you will see is oversight hearings. The administration has enjoyed a very free hand up till this point. I think now the Congress is going to begin pushing on issues that they care about, and they're going to be holding hearings and demanding that Secretary Pompeo appear and explain the progress or the lack of progress. So no more free hand for the White House, but on the other hand, I don't expect any obstruction of the administration's basic approach.
So does the Congress have enough influence to change the direction of the administration's North Korea policy, do you think?
You know, Jesse Helms used to tell us a story about the Congress, and he said that when the Congress was trying to make foreign policy, it was like pushing a cooked spaghetti noodle across the table. It would just curl up, and there was nothing that could be done. What the Congress is best at is obstruction. The Congress can withhold funding. Dennis remembers the agreed framework. The Congress needed to provide money for heavy fuel oil as part of that deal. So if the administration asks for money, the Congress can use its leverage to say no. But if the Congress has an idea, they can never compel the president to pursue that idea.
So you're saying for now, Congress is supporting President Trump's approach to North Korea.
I think so.
And Dennis, some people say that President Trump, now that the midterms is over, will focus even more on North Korea. What is your take?
Well, I think it is true that the president has been spending an enormous amount of time on the campaign trail trying to keep the Senate in Republican hands. And so I think you can logically say that he has been distracted. Certainly he is still saying that he wants a summit with the North Korean leader sometime early next year. So in that regard, I would think his attention will now turn back to this issue in a larger way. Secretary Pompeo will be under some pressure from the president. And we might add Mr. Steve Biegun, the new North Korea representative. Both of them will be under pressure to get for the president something that looks like a positive scenario moving into the next summit.
Now that the talks between Washington and Pyongyang have come to a little stalemate, what should be the position of South Korea? South Korea's plans to sign the end of war declaration within the year, to have Kim Jong-un visit Seoul, that would also be delayed or come to a standstill. So what should be the position of South Korea right now?
Well, you know, the U.S. and South Korea are like to say that they're joined by a rubber band, and they cannot get too far apart for this process to work. So now could be an opportunity for Moon Jae-in to go ahead and stretch that band a little bit and see if through the visit of Kim Jong-un to the South, he can re-energize the denuclearization process. But I think that rubber band is already stretched pretty tight in terms of how far the South can go with the North before Washington begins to worry that they've gone too far and that they are essentially relaxing the pressure on the North to denuclearize. So I hope that President Moon will host Kim Jong-un, that he will pay attention to the optics of that meeting. That meeting will almost certainly precede the second Trump-Kim summit. And it's an opportunity for Moon Jae-in to shift a little bit from focusing on North-South to focusing on security and focusing on denuclearization and really pushing the North to do more to satisfy the U.S. concerns.
And Dennis, this week there was a meeting between Washington and Beijing, diplomatic strategic dialogue. How would this results impact the U.S.-North Korea talks?
I think it's a very important part of the talks that are being held this week. Toward the end of last year, the Chinese really seemed to see the North Koreans as a strategic liability. There's been some drift on the Chinese side. Because the North Koreans shut down the nuclear facility that was of most concern to the Chinese, that nuclear test facility, which is only 50 miles from the Chinese border, Chinese got something big that they wanted, an end to the nuclear testing. They also got an end to the missile testing. And so now it's more stable on the peninsula. So from the Chinese point of view, maybe this is a pretty good situation right now, and why would you push the North Koreans any further right now? The North Koreans aren't going to fire those missiles at them. So I think what the administration has to do in these meetings with the Chinese side is to kind of warn them against that kind of thinking. One of the things, the administration pullout of the INF is a very interesting move for Asia, not just for Europe, because it is an indication that they could be thinking about reintroducing tactical nuclear weapons on submarines in East Asia, and maybe even land-based tactical nuclear weapons. The Chinese need to look at this, because if they don't support us on the North Korean question, they could begin to see a different nuclear posture by the United States.
Well, we'll end our conversation here and watch video for our next topic.
열광의 환호를 올리는 관람자들에게 선서주시며
Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang. The two leaders reaffirmed special friendship and agreed to expand and strengthen their strategic relations. Now, the Cuban president and the North Korean leader to pledge to strengthen their relationship. What are the common interests in strengthening relationship, do you think?
You know, they don't have much going on together, but I think as sort of two of the last vestiges of the communist socialist world order, they have a certain fraternal affection for each other. They have traditionally had close political relations. Kim Jong-un has met with more Cuban officials than almost any other foreign officials. And so I think this is a sign of how few friends in the world North Korea really has, but how dear they are. And so even for a nation like North Korea, even a little bit of economic investment and trade, even a little bit of political support and legitimacy goes a long way. So the friendship being shown here, it's a Cold War legacy, and it shows that those relationships still matter in the North Korean context.
Dennis, Cuban president, this is his first overseas trips, and his first leg was Russia, second leg North Korea, and all three countries are under U.S. sanctions. So these countries bonding together, what message are they giving to the United States?
Well, I think, frankly, that this is a bit of a strategic mistake on the part of the North Koreans to have him come at this point in time. Personalities count in politics, and one of the personalities in this mix is John Bolton as the National Security Advisor. If you've seen his recent statements about the troika of tyranny in the world, I think that the North Koreans need to be a little bit careful of how much they sort of play into John Bolton's hand. They don't want to give him reasons to go to the president and say, you can't trust your North Korean friend. So
I'm really glad you mentioned John Bolton, Dennis, because, he was also the official who has expressed deep concerns historically about Cuba's own WMD programs, especially chemical, biological weapons. And as Dennis points out, if you're North Korea, you don't want to revive any of these nervous worries in the United States about your partners overseas, whether it's Iran or Cuba or Myanmar, with whom you might have some nefarious weapons of mass destruction programs. So I hadn't thought of that connection, but the Bolton angle here is really fascinating because he is no friend of this Cuban government.
Exactly.
How about Iran? I mean, North Korea's top official visited Iran earlier this year and say that North Korea will retain a nuclear knowledge. How should North Korea proceed with the Iran relationship?
This is a place where the North Koreans would be smart to follow the Chinese lead. One of the things the Chinese did in the last 2 weeks that was very important and very telling was they told their companies to cut down the amount of oil they were buying from the Iranians. Consequently, Pompeo gave them a temporary waiver. I think China is reading better what to do with Iran in relation to the United States right now. Even though they don't like our sanctions, they don't like the move back, the move away from the JPOA by the United States, still the Chinese realize this is a big issue for the administration, and they're treading carefully, and I think the North may need to think about that.
This Trump administration, even more than Obama, cares about the company that other nations keep. So, remember Obama said to the leaders of Myanmar, if you want a better relationship with us, you need to sever your ties with North Korea. Well, right now, Trump is trying to pursue better relations with North Korea. If North Korea is going to hold firm to relationships with Iran or Cuba or countries with whom the United States has major disagreements, to put it mildly, that will be viewed by the Trump White House as a signal of North Korea's strategic intentions, that maybe they're not that committed to this new relationship with the United States.
Well, Cuban president was in Pyongyang. Kim Jong-un's official portrait was displayed for the first time. What does this say about his personality cult?
I'm not sure, but clearly he has consolidated his rule. And now, after, more than 5 years as the top leader, he's feeling more comfortable, and he's beginning to celebrate maybe his own cult of personality. He's building his own legacy. He wants to be the leader for many decades to come. And I think in the same way that in ancient cultures, sometimes a child was not given a name until they had survived a certain period of time. Now Kim Jong-un has survived as leader of North Korea for 5 years. It's time to unveil a portrait. Soon maybe he'll have a statue alongside his father and grandfather as well.
Well, on that note, we'll move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a picture of Kim Jong-un on an official inspection of Wonsan Galma tourist area construction site. We see Chairman Kim holding a cigarette here, and he frequently smoked during his on-site inspections, whether it be in a subway or in an orphanage or near a missile launch site. Korea's National Intelligence Service told lawmakers recently that it has been monitoring Chairman Kim's health using three-dimensional video analysis program. What are your thoughts, Dennis?
I think the North Korean leader has some very bad habits. And I think that from a health standpoint, certainly you have to wonder about his stamina, about, frankly, his longevity. He is a chain smoker. We've seen this for years and years. I have been rather wondering about those pictures where he's standing right beside a ballistic missile, smoking a cigarette. So I think that the South Koreans are right to monitor his health condition.
Dennis, does CIA also monitor Kim's health?
You bet. Absolutely. The monitoring of Kim's physical and mental state is a very important issue to this administration.
Frank?
Well, youth compensates for many ills, and so, Obama is also a smoker. I think it's tragic for Kim Jong-un to be a smoker. It will shorten his life, but as a late 30s young man, he's probably robust enough to puff his way through another decade or two before it catches up to him. This is behavior that will shorten his life and shorten his legacy. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I guess the North Korean people will have to decide.
On that note, Dennis, Frank, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Yun Chung.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.